Mufti Muntasir Zaman, he is a scholar of Islamic law and hadith. He currently teaches at Qalam Institute. He completed the Alamiya and Ifta programs in South Africa, and he holds a master's and MA in Islamic studies from the Marksfield Institute in the UK, with a focus on hadith sciences and classical Islamic scholarship. Mufti Muntasir Zaman, he combines traditional learning with an academic research, regularly contributing translations, articles, and reviews. His work reflects a commitment to both scholarly rigor and accessible Islamic education. And interviewing him today, we have our research chief curator, Unzur Latif, who is an electrical engineer by trade, but I don't even think he should be an engineer. I think he should focus on what he loves to do, which is be a huge nerd about history. He is the biggest history nerd you'll ever meet. You can ask him any question about any time period, and he'll give you an answer. So yeah, without further ado, Unzur.
Assalamu alaikum, Mufti Sahab. Welcome to Nuun and Hajj Mubarak. Today I wanted to get started by asking you a very important question. How do you look so young?
All right, Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala sayyidil anbiya wal mursaleen wa ba'd. I actually don't know how to answer that question. I'm sorry, I hate to break it to you guys. I think every time somebody says that to me, I grow like a white strand of hair. And right now, if I open up my turban, you'll just see this bush of white hair. So, jazakallah khair for that, but mashallah, tabarakallah should be before it and after it. No, but honestly, there's a hadith where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, نَضَّرَ اللَّهُ إِمْرَأً سَمِعَ مَقَالَتِي فَوَعَاهَا فَأَدَّاهَا كَمَا سَمِعَ. It's quite interesting. It's embedded in the intellectual tradition that every science has its own perks and specialties. One of the perks of studying the science of hadith is two things. One, you get hopefully an illuminated face, and two, you live a very long life. Many of my hadith teachers live past 100, so and many whose works I've studied. So, if anything, I would attribute it to that.
Wow, mashallah. So, Mufti Sahab, you have studied a lot under a lot of hadith scholars. You have traveled around the world studying in South Africa, becoming a mufti and a renowned hadith scholar at a young age. I have to know, what was the spark that led to all of that?
All right, that's going to take some time. All right, so what inspired me to go on this journey of studying, and in particular studying hadith? I think I had somewhat of a typical immigrant family upbringing, although I was born and raised in New York. But my parents at a very early age, mid-90s, late 90s, they wanted me to study hadith. But they wanted me to study the Quran, do hifz. And I don't think I had much of a choice in the matter there. I just woke up one morning and I know I was in a hifz madrasa memorizing the Quran. It's funny because I remember when my dad decided to... Anybody been to New York or from New York here? You guys ever heard of Flushing Muslim Center? It's a hifz madrasa. That's where I did it. And I remember, I think this was 99, 2000. I'm 8. And my dad's okay, you're going to join a hifz madrasa. And I said, why didn't you ask me before I joined? And my dad just looking at me with this face of surprise, yeah, I'm going to sit down and ask 8-year-old, what do you think about joining a hifz madrasa? So that I didn't have much of a choice. But then one thing led to another. Eventually, I'm memorizing the Quran. And I noticed that the people around me are studying Urdu, Farsi, Arabic, fiqh, hadith. And that inspired me to go and kind of take it to the next step. Because memorizing the Quran, although it's a huge accomplishment, understanding the message of the Quran was always something I hope to achieve looking at my peers. Again, I'm a 14-year-old. It's not I have this philosophical, Ghazalian moment where I'm you know what, I want to change the course of my life. But I decided, you know what, let me go and study. And at the time, I was studying in Canada. So I went from New York to Canada, and I felt that I wasn't getting the level of rigor in my study that I had hoped. And it was a funny story. I actually got in trouble for, let's just say, playing football at a time I should have been playing. I was supposed to be studying, and I ended up playing football. And I kind of got expelled, right? And I decided, you know what, I don't, although the teacher said you can come back, I said, you know what, this could be my excuse to go and pursue my studies further somewhere else. I had a friend who was studying in the UK and another friend who was studying in South Africa. And I said, Bismillah, let me go and study in South Africa. So I'm this 15-year-old, New York-born, Canadian-studied teenager on my way to South Africa. you can imagine what that looked like. I couldn't imagine what that looked like. And I eventually land out, your imagination runs wild. Like, will there be monkeys, lions, Simba, Mufasa? Like, what does South Africa hold for? You don't know, right? I'm this typical ignorant teenager going to South Africa for the first time. And I'm in this madrasa with, give or take, 500 students from 60 different nationalities and backgrounds, from Malaysians to Russians to Chinese to Nigerians, Americans, Canadians, and this diversity in culture and interest really opened my eye to something I really never saw as a first, second generation immigrant growing up in the West. And then one thing led to another, and initially my interests were in philosophy and theology. And if anybody knows anything about hadith, the one science that the scholars of hadith are not too happy about, if you're going to put it anyway, it's philosophy and theology. So I was just sitting down and I'm studying these books of Maturidi theology, right? Isharatul Maram, if anybody's interested. And I'm reading through it, and the student, he passes by and he says, what are you studying? And at the time I remember very vividly, I was in my 5th year of study in South Africa. I was about maybe 19-ish. And I was studying the problem of evil from like a classical Islamic perspective. How did they address husn and qubh? And the student who was more interested in hadith, he passes by and he's telling me, he's like, what are you doing? And I said, I'm studying theology. And he told me point blank, you're wasting your time. And I said, serious? He's like, yeah, you know what? This is a subject not that many people are interested in. Why don't you study hadith? And he introduced me to the Syrian scholar, Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda. And I started reading his works. And the rest is history. From there, I started reading the books of Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda. I got interested in hadith. But I would say that initial foray into theology and philosophy always lingered on in the back burner as I continued studying hadith with different mashayikh in South Africa and elsewhere.
Wow, so you studied from childhood in studying the Quran, and then you went on to study in Canada, and then you went to South Africa, and you had this like interest in theology and philosophy, and then you got into the hadith sciences, right? Yeah. So after all that, after studying via this the traditional madrasa curriculum, you went on to achieve a master's at the Marksville Institute. Many traditional graduates don't do that. What prompted this next path in your life after your studies?
I think this is an interesting question that very often young Muslims such as yourselves, you'll tackle this. And that is, for the most part, we inherit this tradition, right? That is largely from the Arab world, from the subcontinent, from the Middle East, the Eastern regions, which is very rich, which has so much to offer. But we're born and raised here in the West, right? Whichever part, whether it's Canada, UK, America, different states. And just by virtue of going to high school, by virtue of listening to podcasts, watching movies, listening to the news, whatever you're doing, you find yourself exposed to certain ideas and questions that no matter how much you want to bury your head in the ground, at some point it'll catch up with you. Like, okay, as a Muslim woman, why am I wearing the hijab? As a Muslim male, why do I, keep a beard? As a parent, why do I want my children to develop certain ethos? As a Muslim, why do I eat certain things, not eat certain things? And it's interesting because I just came back from Hajj, and when I went for Hajj and when I go for Umrah, this happens to me every single time. You go for Hajj, you go for Umrah, and you're in the midst of this Muslim environment. You hear the adhan, you see people dressed in a particular way, everything's revolving around salah. And within a few days, you feel yourself acclimating to like a full-on Muslim identity. And then the moment you step foot in the airport in Medina or Jeddah, you feel like that first layer is being scraped off. And then you land in Turkey or Dubai, then the second layer is scraped off. And then you land in either JFK, O'Hare, or in DFW, and you feel like you got hit by a nuke. It's like smooth, and you get punched in the face by this reality that we have a completely different lifestyle than what many people in the world are experiencing. So now when I'm in South Africa, I come back to the States, I come back to New York, and I interact with my friends. So as much as I would love to take on this persona of this fully integrated young adult in a Muslim madrasa, I'm always being haunted by, or haunted is a bit of an eerie word, but I'm being, I always have to look myself in the mirror and realize there's some serious questions that I have to address. So then I started reading books by Muslim academics, people like Dr. Ahmed Shamsi, Dr. Jonathan Brown, Scott Lucas, many of these Muslim intellectuals. And I started reading their books, and I'm still in the madrasa. And the first shock to me was just the language with which they're probing some of these serious questions of like, okay, we say Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim are the most authentic. Why are they the most authentic? We follow one of the 4 legal schools. How did these legal schools develop? In my traditional training, yes, these are questions that we addressed, but from a completely different paradigm. Now I'm addressing them from a Western paradigm that looks at history not from a divine perspective, but more from a very secular perspective. And, I'm reading these books and I realize, man, although I'm traditionally trained, there's this vacuum in my knowledge that I would love to fill in. And okay, I shouldn't be saying this out loud, but I kind of dropped out of school in 2nd grade, right? And I never went back to school. I went to madrasa after that. And then somehow I got my GED. I still don't remember how I got it. So now I'm trying to apply to colleges and it's not really working, right? They're like, all right, can you, what do you have to show for? Like, you want to apply to like Oxford's undergraduate program. And I'm like, all right, I did my 2nd grade in Ideal Islamic School in Queens. Does that count for anything? And they're like, okay, we have this weird situation where the person's writing sample is enough to get him into a PhD program, but his credentials should put him back into middle school. And I'm like getting rejected left, right, and center. And the other problem I was facing is I'm trying to enter into like these graduate programs, but I'm like 18 or 19, right? Like I'm just about finishing my my madrasa. So I couldn't do it until I spoke to a friend of mine, and he was in the UK, and he said in some of these Commonwealth universities, they have this interesting option where merit-based master programs are available. So if you can show that although you don't have a high school degree, you don't have an undergrad, but you can show that through your writing sample that you have something to contribute, we'll put you right into the master's program. So alhamdulillah, somehow I showed them some of my writing samples because I was writing at the time, and boom, they just fast-tracked me from 2nd grade to a master's program. And then, I don't know how that happened. But anyways, I'm in there, and fortunately for me, and this is something a lot of traditional scholars are scared of doing, taking that leap into Western academia, whether it's Chicago, whether it's Harvard. You have to understand, these are traditions that are extremely foreign to what we're used to. These are people who, for the most part, are atheist or agnostic. They have a different set of orthodoxies. They have their own scholarship, history. Now, stepping foot into that is like putting your faith right in the front as cannon fodder. And not everyone's ready for that. So over the last decade or so, or 2 decades, what Muslims have been doing in many countries is try to develop this middle space, kind of similar to TISA, where you offer graduate level programs, but taught by Muslims. So you get the best of both worlds. And that was Markfield, where I went to study, and they offer that, but it was a learning curve for me, trying to learn how to write critically, critical thinking, academic writing. So over the year and a half, it really helped me to, mashallah, get exposed to the Western academic side of things and kind of create this hybrid with the traditional studies that I have. And I'll be honest, it was quite a rocky road. It wasn't that easy. Like, for instance, just to give you an example, if I'm reading Islamic history, if I'm reading a book, let's say Tarikh al-Khulafa by Jalaluddin Suyuti, Egyptian scholar, 10th century of our tradition, he'll talk about the Islamic past, he'll talk about the Umayyads, the Abbasids, he'll talk about Abu Bakr, Umar, radiallahu anhuma, and the Khilafah from a very confessional perspective. Now I'm reading somebody like Joseph Van Es, and he's talking about these same things from a very critical perspective, and I'm sitting there thinking like, man, this person is really harsh, but maybe is it that I'm too scared of facing the truth, or is this person really clouding reality with a bunch of academic jargon? So then I thought, you know what, let me start reading further and further. Then I got introduced to some more Muslim academics, and long story short, that's where I find myself today to a certain extent, although that was like 10 years ago.
So you mentioned that during your madrasa days, you were reading Jonathan Brown and Ahmed Shamsi and many others, and before that, you were reading Aqidah books on the problem of evil, like from a more classical perspective, right? Do you believe that your interest in philosophy and your understanding of the problem of evil like led to this interest in like solving like current problems today as well?
Honestly, I would say my studies in theology and philosophy had absolutely nothing to do with it. I feel like there's a part of my brain that I consciously like forgot about, and that is all the theological philosophical studies that I did, and eventually I got into it again. What really led me down the path of, you know, asking some of these more serious questions of, okay, there's hadith, there's Quran, but then you have empirical science and philosophy, and how do we create this bridge between the two? What really got me onto that was, ironically, just a study of history. I feel like as I begin studying history more and more, I realize some of the more, I feel like there's like a tale of two Muslim scholarship. A lot of us growing up, we hear the names Imam Bukhari, Imam Muslim, Imam Nawawi, Ibn Hajar, Shah Waliullah Dihlawi, Ibn Taymiyyah. We hear these names very often and they're thrown around. But when you study their lives much more, like take Ibn Taymiyyah for instance, we often associate him with certain brands or elements of Islam. But then when you study his life, you realize he was a very capable, able scholar of philosophy. He was grappling with some of the most serious existential questions of his time. And then I thought to myself, if they're able to do it there, why can I not do the same for certain questions that are popping up in the day-to-day in my life?
MashaAllah, thank you for sharing. So then after your whole educational journey and you're grappling with questions and understanding and coming out stronger from it, you and becoming such a renowned hadith scholar as well, you wrote the book, The Height of Adam, at the Crossroads of Science and Scripture. Can you tell us about the book and the work that went into it?
First of all, I kind of wish I switched the subtitle for the title now that I think about it. Every time somebody picks up this book, they're like, The Height of Prophet Adam. They're like, I don't care how tall he was. Like, okay, 5'6", 5'7", 5'8". I remember when I published the book first, somebody's like, okay, what's next? The length of Noah's Ark? And I'm like, oh, come on, man. So I'm like, okay, you know what? I wish I put the subtitle first because that's at the core of what I was trying to answer. And that is at the crossroads of science and scripture. So like, what's the sababun nuzul of this? How did this all begin? I remember it was 2018. I got a question from my sister-in-law who said, look, I'm reading this hadith that Adam alayhi salam was a 90-foot tall giant. He was created like that in Jannah, and then he comes to earth and, you know, our ancestors, they were all giants. And I'm going to an MSA event and all these people are like really interrogating me on this and I don't have an answer. Can you share an answer with me? So at the time, there was this famous scholar, Mufti Taqi Uthmani. He has a commentary on Sahih Muslim, famous book of hadith. And I went there and I copy pasted his answer and I sent it to her. And although she was satisfied with the answer, there were still some questions that were lurking in my mind. I said, okay, you know what? This satisfies this side, but it doesn't answer that question. And alhamdulillah, like I got the opportunity of publishing a few books altogether. And my general trajectory of publishing books is I first write a footnote in a book. That footnote becomes a paragraph. The paragraph becomes a paper. The paper becomes an article. And then the article becomes a book. Then the book becomes a footnote. And then that footnote becomes a paper. It's like a weird cycle of life. I can go into detail on why that happens. But then I wrote this footnote in one of my books about this. And then Yaqeen Institute reached out to me and they said, hey, you know, why don't you start writing some papers on hadith? And I thought, you know what? Why not write on this particular topic? So I wrote a paper at the time. And I said, you know what, this deserves a book-length treatment. And as I was writing the paper, because you have to understand, what's the question that I'm trying to answer? The question is, an authentic hadith is telling us that Adam alayhi salam is was 90 feet tall, and his progeny was decreasing in height. Now, if anybody studied archaeology and science, archaeologically speaking, when we look at some of the remains of humans, at least hundreds of thousands of years tracing back, they're relatively the same height as you and I. And then when you study science, in terms of human anatomy and physics, it's really hard to imagine human beings that large. And I thought, you know what, I have to answer this. But the biggest problem I have is, as I told you guys, I dropped out in second grade. So my science is kachara. Like, my science is absolutely horrible. Like, I just about know how to do like addition and subtraction and multiplication. I'm just about not getting ripped off in Walmart from normal purchases. So science, math, archaeology was like out of my imagination. But I had to really tackle this because I've noticed some scholars who are trying to answer this question, how did they answer it? Like, literally, a true story. There's a scholar from Morocco who wrote this 3-volume book on problematic hadith, and he wanted to answer this. And I'm reading this, and he's like, yeah, you know what? There are actually archaeological remains of human giants. And these human giants, our forefathers, were like 60 feet tall and 40 feet tall. But unfortunately, what happened was the Smithsonian, this museum in America, went around the world and stole all of the bones and had them burned and incinerated. So we don't have the evidence anymore. So I'm like, wow, I actually never came across this. And then I look at the footnote, and you would not believe what his reference was. Can anyone guess? The Onion. Anybody heard of The Onion before? It was literally The Onion. He quoted the Onion. I said, Inna lillahi wa inna. I'm like, we're cooked. Like, we're done. Like, if this is your citation, The Onion, we're done. And the thing is, this is a published book, and, so many people are reading it. So I decided, you know what? I don't want to fall into the same problem again. Let me make sure I do my research, but I don't know jack squat about science or archaeology. So I started emailing a bunch of scientists and archaeologists. I started reaching out to people. And for the next year, that's all I did. I delved into the science part of it, like putting aside the history, the hadith, and all of that discussion. I was going into like, okay, scientifically speaking, is it possible that human beings could be that large? Okay, the square cube law. Are there exceptions? What about dinosaurs? What about, a saber tooth? What about tales of giants? And so I really went down that rabbit hole for like months. Okay, I got that done. Then I had to go down the rabbit hole of archaeology that, okay, do we have evidence of giants? And if we do, whatever happened to them? I started emailing a bunch of archaeologists. I started going to random museums. They're seeing this guy in a turban and a jubba walking around a museum looking at like dinosaur bones. And they're wondering like, what happened to the guy? Somebody find this guy's family. Maybe he got lost, right? So anyways, I'm like emailing a bunch of people trying to figure out the specifics of this issue. So that took me a year. And then after, I wouldn't say mastering it, getting to a point where I was confident with that, alhamdulillah, I had my background in hadith and the science of hadith and fiqh and history. I put the two together, and I would say from like the 3 or 4 books that I've written, this was perhaps the most challenging for me in my life.
So thanks for telling me why you wrote the book. And of course, so I want to tell you why I read it, actually. And this takes us to our next one. So I read a book because I had heard a summary I had heard a summary in a session about your perspective on this hadith, right? So I mentioned it to a former friend of mine, and he ended up takfiring me over this. He literally called me a kafir, like an atheist, because, like as you said, there's an authentic hadith, and what I understood from your perspective is like maybe the Prophet didn't say it and stuff like that. And also, that's a 1-star review on your Amazon. If I saw.
It's fine. I get a lot of those. The nature of what I'm writing demands that I'm going to get a bunch of 1-star reviews. We need to get these guys, Nuun collected $5 a piece. Everybody go and like give me 5 stars. What do you call it? Like a troll farm?
Yeah.
The opposite of a troll farm.
So after being takfired, I read this book. I decided to read the book for a more in-depth understanding, right? And I found this quote particularly insightful regarding the message of the book. Unscrupulously dismissing a problematic hadith is a simple task that even an ignoramus can accomplish. The brilliance of an intellectual shines when he can resolve the contention and provide a suitable interpretation. This quote, in my opinion, exemplifies your methodology. Anyone can reject or ignore, but a true intellectual will address and engage with what they see as problematic to find a way forward. So, in your journey, you mentioned that this specific topic was mentioned by your sister-in-law, and then you wrote an article for Yaqeen and stuff, right? And then you gained the confidence through various, and you had already gained the confidence in hadith studies through your through the madrasa curriculum, and then you said your whole journey of getting the confidence in the secular sciences as well, so-called secular sciences. Can you also expand on that if you can, on this whole journey of like how you, like, did you not fear being ostracized by your peers, like?
This is a very important question that I don't want to make it too personal on my life, but I think it relates to so many people over here. And what is that? You grow up in a family, your family has certain, traditions, habits. The people around you, your local masjid has certain traditions and habits. And you find yourself evolving, growing, and at some point you realize, I need to make certain changes in my life. I want to do certain things differently. When you try to explain that to your family, when you try to introduce that to your family, you get one of two reactions, right? More often than not, it's a visceral reaction that, why are you doing this? Why are you saying this? Whether it's something as simple as, I want to go out of state for my college education, or I don't want to be a doctor, I want to be an artist, or like, I don't know, I feel like my passion is to study Islam as opposed to becoming like a lawyer. Whatever it is, like oftentimes when we want to challenge certain established norms, it can become very difficult, right? And that is true for any field or any society, any area. For me in particular, this book honestly did cause some rifts because الناس أعداء لما جهلوا. There's a famous statement which says that people's most ardent enemies happens to be their own ignorance, right? الناس أعداء لما جهلوا. So when I wrote this book, word started getting, just as an FYI, so people don't misunderstand like what my main contention in this book is. There's an authentic hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari that says that Adam alayhi salam was a particular height. My response to it is, there are three ways of understanding this. One way is, let's interpret the hadith in a way that perhaps can reconcile science and the hadith together. My second approach was, perhaps that Prophet ﷺ never said this. And the third is, you don't have to have answers for everything. You can even just say, Wallahu a'lam. And that was my conclusion. But however, word started getting around that, okay, this person is criticizing Sahih al-Bukhari. This person, he's bending backwards just for the purposes of science and all that good stuff. And it did cause a degree of pushback. And it was a learning curve for me because I'll tell y'all this. Not every time you get ostracized or you get pushed to a particular corner is it a bad thing for you. Like when I was getting pushed to the corner and a lot of people are like, hey, why are you saying this? What are you trying to achieve? What about what the scholars are saying? It gave me a moment of pause and made me reconsider, is it possible that I'm going too into one direction and giving too much credence to the science? And then that allowed me to reevaluate the middle ground. But on the other hand, it showed me that, okay, this is a very important crossroads for me. That not between science and religion, but between, should I try to say something that will be helpful for people I feel are struggling with this, on the one hand, or should I just stay quiet and not really air my views? And I thought, you know what? It's important for me to make sure I did my due diligence because anybody can air their views, right? I can come today and say, you know what, based on my reading of Islam, it's perfectly fine for people to not pray and pay zakah instead. Or I don't have to fast, I can drink water and eat bread and that should be enough. I can come out with the most ridiculous views just because I want to, but getting that pushback really opened my eyes to the importance of qualification and consultation. So my next step was, I'm taking my book to different scholars and telling them, hey, this is what I'm saying. Do you agree, disagree? And the general consensus was, we agree with you, but we're too scared to say it openly. It was at that point that I realized, you know what? If the only pushback is not that this is like heresy or this is like anathema, the only problem is I don't want to go open about it, then you know what, let me take a bullet for the team and let me be open about it.
Wow, mashallah. So you mentioned like you were you were questioning whether you should air these views or not, and all the other scholars were like, "Oh, I agree with you, but don't tell anybody." Was there any personal experiences that made you realize, like, as Mufti Muntasir Zaman, it is my duty to actually go out with this? I mean, you can literally live in comfort and not tell anybody about this and not face any backlash. But was there a personal experience that caused you to be like, this is something I must do, this is my duty?
For the fear of sounding like Superman or Batman, like somehow I had this moment of like, I'm going to save the universe, or like I invented the wheel. I mean, I don't think it's that dramatic. I just like wrote a book on hadith and science, right? Inshallah, it was beneficial for other people. I didn't have to make this like life-threatening decision of like, okay, I'm going to write this book and there's going to be like a target on my back. Well, there was a bit, like a social media target, for whatever that's worth. No, honestly, I do feel personally, not all views should be aired, right? Like, I have a lot of views, and I'm not going public with all of those views because I feel everybody has this journey, right? This journey of development where you're thinking and you're criticizing and you're critiquing and researching. I wasn't comfortable to air all of my views, although I found some of them to be helpful, until I was comfortable and confident that my views were well-researched and peer-reviewed. So I think it was more of a selfish reason. It's not like I put on a cape and I said, let me save the world. It's more like, man, I did like 4 years of research. Let me just put it out there at this point. I'm not going to, just delete the file and like have a tear go down and go like, for the betterment of the ummah, I'm going to delete this. I said, listen, I wrote a book. Let me publish it. Let's see what happens of it. So I decided to go forward with it. Funny story, by the way. I remember, like I said, I dropped out in second grade, right? So like typing, writing, English composition, a lot of this I did on my own. So when I was writing my first book, I was still learning some of the short keys like Control Z, Control A, copy, paste. So my first book was on the science of hadith. And like, are the collections of hadith a reliable and accurate representation of the Prophet ﷺ's words and deeds? So anyways, I remember I was in South Africa writing and still like poking at the keyboard, figuring out how to write like a caveman. And at some point, I figured out Command A is select everything. Is like selected. Command C is copy, and then Command V is it to paste. So anyways, I'm figuring all of this stuff out. So I put Command A and I selected everything, but I forgot the next step. And then I pressed like a letter, and I saw the entire book in front of me just erase and vanish. At that time, I didn't learn Command Z, which is like undo. So like my entire book, it was like a whole year of work, just like got erased right in front of me. And I'm thinking like, inna lillahi, like literally salatul janazah, right? Like, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, the book is gone. I could have just Command Z'd it. So I'm thinking like, okay, what's the best way to do this? Maybe if I close the file and I open it up again, it'll give me the option, do you want to recover it? And let's just say a book was lost at that point, and I never had a book again. I could have done that with this book, but I decided not to, and eventually I published it. By the way, I know how to type and everything. This was just like 2013.
Dang, that's a loss. Yeah. So it is very rare for the common person to hear about ulama engaging with hadith in the context of biology and archaeology. Were you the first to engage with the content of hadith based on the empirical sciences, or were there hadith scholars in the last 1400 years that were doing this as well?
I think the only benefit I have of making it seem like I'm the first person, although by no stretch of the imagination am I, it's just like social media. Like I just happen to post my research on like Twitter and Facebook, and I think like most people's memory is like circa 2020. Like if you go back up on your Facebook feed, if it doesn't exist, it never existed in humanity. So yeah, I'm by no stretch of the imagination the first person to explore this question. If you look at some of the earliest scholars of hadith, like Imam Bukhari, Imam Muslim, Yahya ibn Ma'in, they grappled with this question as well, but there was a reason why they didn't do so very openly. So if I want to talk about scholarly engagement with this issue, by the way, is everybody feeling hot over here? Am I the only one? I know I'm like wearing like a hijab over here, so it's kind of like my fault. Like I should blame myself, but like everybody's okay? There's a fan over here. If everybody's okay, I apologize for the heat in advance. I'm not responsible for that, but go and buy some more notepads and inshallah we can have, we got to up the game and start selling some more stuff. We'll have the brothers sing some more poetry inshallah and put a hat over there and hopefully we'll get some more funds. No, I like to divide Islamic history into three parts. The first half of Islamic history, the second. You don't have to give it to me, by the way. I didn't mean that so you take it away from 300 people and just give it to me. Let them enjoy. It's fine. I'll melt away over here on my own. So basically, when I look at Islamic history, I like to divide it into three parts. The first 700 years, you can talk about the early period of Islamic intellectual history. The second 700 years, the second part of Islamic intellectual history. And then I look at the modern era, circa 1850 and beyond, the advent of modernity. In the first 600, 700 years, Muslim scholars were really grappling with these same questions. We're not the first people to think about the problem of evil. We're not the first people to talk about the existence of a creator. We're not the first people to talk about gender norms. These were questions that scholars grappled with, but the early Muslim scholars grappled with it much more subtly than others, only because they had some concerns of it being abused. Then when you start looking at later scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Hajar, Suyuti, Shah Waliullah, they start addressing this much more openly. And then you have the modern era where it's like an open game where everybody's grappling with these questions. The challenge though is, and why people think that I somehow made this new contribution, although I never did, I just happened to write it, is that in the English language, we have this weird dichotomy. You have people who've gone to one particular extreme, and because we're being recorded, I don't want to take any names over here, but let's just say some people have gone to one particular extreme and they're like, okay, what is the arbiter of truth? What is what do I consider to be the be all and end all? And for them, it was science, morality, so they would say evolution. We really don't care what the Quran and Hadith have to say. As a Muslim, my first priority is to privilege empirical science. My first priority is to give preference to whatever philosophy has to say. And you have that entire group. And I'm talking about in English. And they have written a lot on this. And then you have a second group of people who went to the opposite extreme. And they're like, you know what? To hell with all of these scientists, these philosophers. They just drank the Kool-Aid of the modern West and secularism and all these isms, and you can't trust them and who cares about them. We need to double down and hold to our tradition and just translate what we've inherited. And then I realize I walk into this middle space and I'm like, wait, hey guys, you can hear your own echo, there's nobody here. I'm like, why don't we come to the middle ground over here? In Arabic, this discussion is happening. In Urdu, the discussion is happening. In Farsi, and all these languages, they're coming to this middle ground. But in English, because we've only started writing more popularly in English from the 60s and the 70s and much more common in the early 2000s, it's only now that we realize, why don't we come to this middle space? And that's why I started writing, and I noticed that people are, there's a need to publish on this. So to answer your question, no, I'm not the first one. Perhaps hundreds of thousands of scholars have addressed it. In the modern era, people have and continue to address these issues. It's just the middle ground between one extreme of over-privileging science and philosophy and archaeology and the other extreme of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. This small little lacuna that I'm trying to fill, there aren't that many people doing it. There just aren't that many people who are writing accessible, perhaps, that makes it seem like somehow, I'm donning a cape and trying to save humanity, where in reality, I'm really not.
And in that regards of finding this middle zone, and of course, there's a lot of writers throughout Islamic history and in all the other languages. You write down in your book in page 8, Hadith scholars engage with and often critique the content of Hadith based on the empirical knowledge that was available to them. The precision of this form of engagement sharpened as their knowledge of the empirical sciences grew. So, and then throughout your book, you quote various examples of such, right? So clearly this engagement was common amongst Hadith scholars in the past. Why is it something so controversial today? You mentioned the two extremes, but obviously the other extreme makes the whole thing controversial. But why is it so extreme for even a middle path, even finding a middle zone? Why is it so controversial?
Before I answer that question, by a show of hands, how many people are still following along? How many people are still with me? All right, good. I just want to make sure I'm not losing people along the way. I know it's kind of hot in here, and the subject isn't the most accessible. If I'm confusing anybody or you need some clarification, feel absolutely free to raise your hands. If you're feeling hot, I got a suggestion for you. You can go buy a notepad over there and use it as a fan. Like that's one way of feeling better. But you have to buy it. Otherwise, the fan won't work. I'm telling you. But anyways, everybody with me so far? We're gonna get to the prompt soon, don't worry. If I lost anybody, feel free to raise your hand. I'll go back a few steps or all the way to the beginning again and make sure we lose hopefully nobody. It's a bit of a deep subject, and I hope that everybody's able to benefit. All right, so to answer this question, this is a question that some of you may have thought about in the past, and that is, why is it that when Muslim communities, particularly in the West, they get pushback on certain issues, that why do you do certain things or why aren't you doing certain things? Instead of engaging with it, in some ways we retreat to our comfort zone. There are two answers to this. Do you guys understand what the question is? Everybody with me? Anybody not with me so far? You can raise your hand. Yes? No? Okay. I'll buy a notepad for you if you want. I'll buy a second one. 2 fans work better than 1. Yes? Yeah. So the question is this. When we look at some of the questions that often face the Muslim community, whether it's evolution, whether it's why do you not accept certain scientific issues, or whether it's something like the hijab, or whether it's dress code, or whether it is gender norms, the moment you express a critical voice, oftentimes you'll find people in the masajid or in our communities, instead of welcoming critique, they tend to have a very negative reaction and they retreat back into this comfort zone where they feel silencing the question tends to be a better response than trying to engage with it. Is that clear? That's very often the case in many communities. And why is that the case? I want to give 2 answers. The first one is more of a sympathetic answer. I think it's important for us not to be so harsh on ourselves and our communities, because in a post-colonial world, you have to understand this inferiority complex. Dr. Sherman Jackson, he talks about this in one of his papers, that we have this double conscious that we often struggle with. That imagine you're an immigrant who comes from a different community, like whether it's Sudan, Somalia, Egypt, Jordan, Bangladesh, India, and you come to the West in the 90s, and you have this reality, you have this existence, and now you're trying to raise a family in Dallas, Texas, or in Michigan, Detroit, or in Queens, New York, and you're beginning to realize, whether you're a scholar or a layman, that we're not equipped to really answer these questions. And you don't want to look weak. So when somebody's pushing back, the natural response is, let's shut down the question, not because we're scared, it's just that given our new post-colonial reality, we may just not have the answers. And it will take a new generation of people to grow up in this society who kind of learn both sciences and both worlds and are able to provide a more coherent answer. So the first thing I would say is, I don't want to be so harsh on our uncles and aunts and our imams and community leaders, because trying to tackle these very serious existential questions is not easy. That imagine coming to your local imam and telling them like, hey, can you explain Islam's stance on sexuality? And he's like, I don't even know what that word means. Like, don't say that word in the masjid, it's haram, like that, because for them, this is like a completely different universe that they're trying to explore. The second reason is, is what you call the floodgate argument, right? That if you try to probe a question even a little bit, it's like you give a finger, they're gonna grab the hand. It's that if I start entertaining these questions, there's this fear that this army of liberal atheists, agnostics will come and take over our masajid, which is completely unfounded, but that generally tends to be, and sometimes for good reason, you'll see that certain spaces are co-opted by people with certain agendas. So now, to answer your question, I feel it's the responsibility of this generation, you and I, who were born and raised over here. We understand what it means to be American. We understand what it means to be part of the West. We understand Islamic history. We understand Western history. We understand the questions of morality. While we have a firmly rooted commitment to Islam, and particularly the scholars amongst us, to really tackle the bull and take it by its horns.
Exactly. I 100% agree, Mufti Sahib. Like that's such a enlightening.
By the way, I'm sorry if I'm giving very long-winded answers. If I have like a 2-minute timer, please just put a timer over there. I'm sorry. I know like we haven't even gotten to the first prompt and I'm yapping away. I apologize for that.
No, it's no worries. We're on schedule. Okay. No, but what you said about our post-colonial anxieties and this fear of like breaking away, like because of this, like I said, I think that we've sought these rigid definitions of Islam, where we've basically turned like not just like the core, but we've turned like a lot of these peripheral matters into unquestionable tenets of the faith, and to question even like height of Adam or something, it's like, did the Prophet really say it? Is like, what are you doing? You're destroying the whole tradition. Like. Another example from your book, in one of the footnotes, you mentioned Shah Waliullah's opinion on the splitting of the moon. Now, Shah Waliullah, you mentioned him earlier today. He's one of the greatest scholars of Islamic history. Majority of the Muslim world owes their conception of Islam to him. I think South Asia makes like a huge chunk as well, and then beyond that too. Like South Asia, South Africa, and many other areas in the Muslim world, right? But he didn't believe that the splitting of the moon story was authentic. And if you were to mention that to somebody today, they'd call me a heretic. Like if I say that, I'm called a heretic, right? It's like, oh, Shah Waliullah didn't believe that the moon split, and he interpreted the Quran accordingly. What are you using? Like that, right? So, but because of this fear, people have resorted, and this post-colonial anxiety, people have resorted to this comfortable dogmatic approach where we don't question anything, we just listen and just go on, right? And I believe that your work stands as an antidote to this phenomena of dogmatic approaches. By engaging with hadith critically, you demonstrate that Islam is not a stagnant repetition of inherited knowledge, but a living tradition that invites inquiry and engagement. Islam is not about passive acceptance, but about an active and thoughtful relationship between humanity and the divine. And with that, I would like to go to prompt 1. So prompt 1, do you agree that we've abandoned engagement with Islam for a dogmatic understanding of it? If so, what are some consequences of resorting to a dogmatic understanding? Dogmatic is when you don't question and you just listen and just repeat.
Okay, let me simplify that for you in a second grader's terms, right? Since I'm from second grade. Anyways, basically the prompt is, do you feel in your personal life and in your communal life as a Muslim, either individually or going to your masajid or speaking to your families, that we've adopted this approach of blindly following everything that we've inherited without questioning it? Whether it's the way we pray, whether it's our history, whether it's our fiqh, whether it's our aqidah, do we find ourselves just accepting things without questioning? Is that the case? Or do you think that we're much more on the other side, we're too critical? If either, the question is, what are some consequences of resorting to a dogmatic understanding? In whatever capacity, whether it's family ties, family related, like, you know what, I can't imagine my son or daughter not becoming a doctor or not taking a degree. That dogmatic approach, particularly to Islam, have you witnessed it in your life? If so, what do you feel are some of the negative ramifications of that?
It's like silent writing for 5 minutes and then discussion after.
You see, that's a trick. You can't write if you don't have a notepad. And when you come here, they tell you no notepads are allowed in this event. So you get the final conclusion, right?
Okay, who wants to answer? All right, there we go.
Assalamu alaikum, guys. So, my answer, what is it? So the question is pretty much asking, do we take everything at face value or are we just questioning everything? I feel as though we've reached a point where both is happening simultaneously. So, to elaborate on that a little bit, we've reached the point where we've accepted everything at face value and we blindly just question everything. If somebody says, oh, it's from an authentic hadith, they show us the hadith, they say, all right, it's from a hadith, so if the hadith says so, we go with it. But on the flip side of it, we've also reached a point where if something goes against the hadith, or if something is like deliberately haram, somebody says, okay, show me proof. They will question you, they will counter you, they will question you to no ends and no avails. So I feel as though we've reached a point where both is happening simultaneously, and a line is hard to be drawn, because where do we draw the line on that? Where is the balance between both sides of that spectrum?
Now, a sister. All right, I see a hand in the back.
So I kind of took the question a little bit differently. Like, I kind of said, when I first started learning about Islam, there was so much to learn. And so there was just so much information that I was trying to absorb. And because I wanted to learn things so quickly, I kind of just took things as they were, not really questioning it. So I guess like when you're not being more intentional with your learning, you can come into like a dogmatic understanding, like just listening to everyone is telling you to believe. So if you're not being like, what am I trying to say? If you're not careful, it's very easy to fall into that. Or just like a more, I guess, unanimous example is like when your family is telling you to do something and you're questioning why you're supposed to be doing that thing, and they feel as a respect thing that you shouldn't be questioning them, but it's just like you're just curious to know, like, to understand what it actually is. So yeah.
Jazakallah khair.
MashaAllah, both very profound observations. Hopefully, you can keep the timer in front of me in case I go on for too long. To the first point, I think that is a very good answer to the prompt, because ultimately there's no such thing as one reality. Everyone's reality is different. If you grow up in a certain family, perhaps in that family, everything is being questioned. If I'm going to college, if I'm going to university, if I grow up around people of a particular background or mindset, we may be hyper skeptical. And in many circles, that tends to be the problem, where anytime something comes our way, it's fake news, or like, I don't trust it, I'm going to question it, until I satisfy this insatiable desire to get to the bottom of things. So I think that is the correct answer, in my opinion, that the prompt is, do you agree we've abandoned engagement with Islam for a dogmatic understanding of it? I think the answer is, who is we? Who are we? Like, because certain families, even the most basic things cannot be accepted. I remember I had just finished studying and I was in my local masjid in New York, and there was somebody who followed the Maliki fiqh. And I'm sitting down talking to him about the Maliki way of praying salah, where you call it sadal, where you let the hands on the side as opposed to folding it. And this one imam, he passes by and he says, tell this person to stop asking and talking about too many things, asking too many questions and talking about too many things. And in my mind, I realized, like, this is such a legitimate question and engagement that we're having. That person's critique is coming from a place of pure ignorance. But on the other hand, I remember going to certain events. I remember I was once invited to this mist event near Columbia University. They rented out a hall and had these people coming and asking me such fundamental questions about Islam, which was fine. But when I gave a follow-up answer, they start questioning the answer. And then when I gave an answer to that, I realized that there's something more serious that's at play over here. They're not looking for answers. What they're doing is they're suffering from this hyper skepticism, which honestly can never be satiated. And have we abandoned, engagement with Islam? For some of us, we're way too critical. But in many other circles, we just follow whatever comes our way, right? Like, so if our parents are telling us to do certain things, when somebody comes to us with something slightly different, we feel like we're drowning, we start to panic, we're not sure what to do, where we should actually try to engage. But then you raise something very important, which I think is at the heart of this. And that is, where's the line? Like, where's the line between accepting things at face value and being critical? Because on the one hand, mashallah, the sister brought up a very important point, and that is, if we somehow get too comfortable, we may just blindly accept everything. But if we want to be critical, there has to be some qualification. So Allah tells us in the Quran, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. The general default of people who are unqualified is we need to seek out scholarship. So if somebody comes to me and says, the fiqh has to be in a particular way, your theology has to be in a particular way, Islamic history is such and such, I should be critical in the way I engage with it, but I have to be critical based on knowledge that I either know, or I ask somebody who's knowledgeable, or I refer back to somebody who's knowledgeable. If I don't do that, honestly, being dogmatic may be more helpful than me exploring areas without qualification and getting lost. In fact, one of the scholars would say that what is the biggest calamity to befall the ummah? He says, nisful nahwi wa nisful faqih wa nisful tabib. هذا أفسد اللسان وهذا أفسد الأبدان وهذا أفسد الأديان. He says, what was the biggest calamity to befall the ummah? He says, half a physician, half a scholar, and half a grammarian. Because one of them destroyed your tongue, the other destroyed your body, and the last one is the worst of all of them, he destroyed your deen. So having qualification is that. So there's 2 or 3 tiers. Tier 1, where I'm too lazy to do research on the topic. It's better for me to just stay quiet and just refer back to scholarship. Number 2, I do research. It's enough to pick between opinions, but not hold an opinion. In that case, I can kind of choose between, okay, this fiqhi opinion or this theological position. And the highest tier is, I've done the craft and the work, and I'm willing to go down the need to study and give a proper answer. I think I'm like 5 minutes over for that. Anyways, I hope that provides some commentary.
All right, Jazakallah khairan. So speaking of like dogmatic approaches, the first mention of in your book of dogmatic approaches has really nothing to do with how we approach Islam, actually. In your book, you describe the worldview that holds science as the ultimate arbiter of defining reality as dogmatic scientism. This clearly shows that dogma is not limited to what we traditionally call religion. Why did you feel the need to make this point?
It's so important for us to not stereotype religious folk, right? We often look at the stereotypical uncle in the masjid or the aunt in the masjid who has nothing to do but rabble and like yell at people. Well, maybe there's some truth to that, right? Like, I'm not going to deny that reality. But dogmatism, because what happens, right? In our minds, when we think about critical thinking, when we think about intellectuals, you'll think about Richard Dawkins, you'll think about scientists, you'll think about, I don't know, your teacher, your instructor, your professor of philosophy. These are the people who come to our mind. But just because people can put on a veneer of intellectual thinking, it does not mean that they'll fall into dogmatism themselves, right? I have a friend who currently just passed his PhD. He got his PhD in biomolecular science. And he was telling me how enshrined evolution is in the academy that even the most critical thinking intellectuals of his university, when he tries to push back on it, you can see how upset they are, as though you're burning down their church, as though you're critiquing their religion. So the same people who are crying about religious dogmatism fall into it themselves. And ultimately, Islam is trying to promote a level of healthy critical thinking, which allows us to find the balance between, on the one hand, exploring the unknown, but doing so with qualification.
So basically, you're saying that these dogmatic attitudes people have, where they take these worldly claims as axiomatic, as something so obvious that there's no point in questioning or proving it, it's no different from what other people call traditional, like what is traditionally called as religious dogma, right? So then is there really any difference between quote unquote secular and quote unquote religious if the dogmatic approaches are the same?
So this is an important question. That do we have something known as religious and secular? These terms, religious and secular, are born out of a very particular religious experience among Catholics and the Protestant Revolution, right? There's the term secular and the term religion are very weird terms that it's very hard to speak about. Islamically, we have what is known as the deen and dunyawi binary, where there are certain things that are religious, like the Quran, the hadith, the way you pray, giving charity, respect to your parents. And then there are certain things that are considered this worldly. For instance, what you decide to wear, what you decide to eat for breakfast, do you want to go to the gym, not go to the gym. These are certain decisions that aren't really impacted by religion. So there's two parts to first of all, what's the question? The question is, when we talk about blindly following, dogmatism, is this something specific to religion? Absolutely not. You can be a dogmatic vegan for all that I care, right? Like you're so dogmatic about it that, you know what, this is my way of life. Anybody who doesn't follow it, I'm going to critique them. You can be a dogmatic gym rat that, like, if somebody decides not to, I don't know, do bench presses, he's a loser. Or like, if you're not doing cardio in a particular way, you're wasting your life. You can be a dogmatic artist or painter. Like, dogmatism is a human problem where we decide that we like something, we pursue something, and everything else is either problematic or unacceptable. Now, is there a binary between religious and the secular? Islamically, these terms are loaded, but I would say for sure you have three tiers. You have what is considered this worldly. Like I said, what you dress like, what you eat, what are your dietary decisions. Islam isn't going to force you to have falafel for breakfast or have za'atar as a side, or like, that's not, Islam isn't concerned too much with this. The other is your prayer, your zakah, your dua, your reading of the Quran. That's religious. But then you have this middle tier, which is kind of, it can be religious if you have the right intention. That I'm going to sleep at night. Islam doesn't care if you're going to sleep at 8 o'clock or you're going to sleep at 10 o'clock. But if I decide to go to sleep early so that I can wake up for Fajr, Islam doesn't care if you decide to go to the gym or not. But if I want to get healthy so I can spend more time with my family, so that I can pray better, so that I can be more, connected with my religious obligations, what was once considered quote unquote secular, dunyawi, now picks up a level of religiosity on a secondary level.
So in other words, like anything, like this so-called religion versus secular binary doesn't really impact us, and it's a very Catholic idea of like the world, right? This separation into religious versus seculars, sacred or profane. And in your book, you combined like this, like the study of hadith, which is quote unquote religious, with biology and anthropology, which are quote unquote secular, right? To have a more holistic understanding of conceptualizing Islam. And with that, as Wali recited in the beginning, there's the poem from Iqbal, that last line in Payam-e-Mashriq, Har mulk mulk-e mas ke mulk-e khuda mas, Payam-e-Mashriq 200. Har mulk mulk-e mas ke mulk-e khuda mas. Now please forgive my pronunciations, Wali. I am desi. So Iqbal was really into German philosophy, and he was really into Nietzsche and all of them. And so people were asking him, like, where in the Sharia is this? Where in Islam is this? Why are you into this? Why are you studying all this? And he was like, Har mulk, every dominion, every field, every mulk is a mulk of ours because it's a mulk of the God of ours. And like you said, anything that is dunyawi, from the food you eat, from the clothes you wear, from everything, it has a potential to be dini, like with the intentionality and everything, right? So can you please give some impact on that? Yeah. Oh, and there's another quote by Iqbal as well. All that is secular, therefore, is sacred in the roots of its being. There is no such thing as a profane world. All is holy ground. As a prophet so beautifully puts it, the whole of this earth is a mosque.
By the way, Holy Ground is the name of the flyer. I was telling them, like, they said, mashallah, this thing was like RSVP'd very quickly. I said, because it looks like I just dropped a mixtape based on the flyer. If you look at the flyer, like, it's such a dark, like, I'm coming for your money, right? But mashallah, I like the aesthetics of it. I don't know who the designer is, so no offense to that guy, but I really like it. Anyway, before we get to the prompt, I know that's going to be the next thing. I do want to drive this point home. In Christianity, and in particular Catholicism, there is this separation of religion and secular. It's actually rooted in the biblical concept of the spirit and the flesh. There's this idea of the spirit, and then there's this idea of the flesh. To, give unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, give unto God what belongs to God. This complete separation. But as Muslims, we do not believe in a mutually exclusive relationship, meaning that politics is purely this world, secular. There's no religious connotation to it. The Quran and Hadith is purely this religious experience that has no worldly connection. And the best evidence of this distinction between secular and religious being a product of this Catholic experience is the concept of monasticism. Rahbaniya. You have these people who completely disassociate from the world and they live in caves because there's a separation between the spirit and the flesh. As Muslims, Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he actually said to a person who came to meet Aisha radiallahu anha and said, explain to me the ibadah of the Prophet. Explain to me the ibadah of the Prophet. And Aisha's response was, this is his day-to-day experience. And they responded by saying, what? That's all the Prophet ﷺ does? The word that was used is yataqilluna. They felt as though it was insignificant. When the Prophet ﷺ found out about this, what he did was, he went onto the pulpit and he said, Inni atqakum wa akhshakum lillah. That don't think you understand religion better than me. Don't think you understand religion better than me. Because one person found out that the Prophet ﷺ got married and he said that I'm going to live a life of celibacy. Another person found out that the Prophet ﷺ, he sleeps at night and he said, I'm going to spend the entire night doing ibadah. Another person found out that the Prophet ﷺ, he spends time with his family, and this person said that I'm going to spend all of my time and my wealth in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet ﷺ, he kind of grounded them in this reality that there's no distinction between the religious and the secular. Rather, there are three tiers. You have the huquq and the rights that you owe to the first tier. What you eat, your family, you have to do that. Then you have the religious tier, but there is this bridge that is needed, that you put science in conversation with religion. You put your family responsibilities in like, to give you an example, I get one of my students, he came to me the other day and he says, listen, I got two offers. I got an offer from medical school in Brown University, or do I go to Florida? And I said, look, this is really a mundane choice that's up to you, but Islam does play a slight role in this, and that is which of the two will be more conducive for your Islamic livelihood, right? Like, if you find yourself going to Florida and getting stuck in the party life, maybe it makes more sense for you to go to Brown and you'll have better company over there. So again, we face these questions all the time. Where am I going to college? Who am I going to marry? What am I going to do? What name am I going to give my child? They do seem like very profane questions, but Islam does play a role in how we go about making these decisions. I still have 30 seconds, so I beat the clock. I deserve a round of applause.
Exactly, and that's exactly right. And this religion versus secular binary has impacted us as Muslims because we use this word religion and to describe Islam. We say, what is Islam? It's a religion. And subconsciously, we ascribe this Western definition of religion into Islam, which impacts how we... So the second prompt is, how has the religion versus secular binary... how has a religious versus secular mindset impacted the way you view and interact with the world and Islam itself? How has your separation of things as either religious or secular, either sacred or profane, how does it impact the way you interact with the world and view Islam and interact with everything?
If I can just elaborate on the question very quickly. Like, one of the struggles that we often have as young professionals in the West is this compartmentalizing of Islam, where I'm going to college, I'm going to school, and like my Muslim identity goes into my backpack. Now, how has that distinction between Abdullah or Zainab in school, or Abdullah and Zainab in work, versus Abdullah and Zainab in the masjid or at home, how has that impacted the way you interact? And maybe you don't. Maybe that's not your experience. You can write on that as well.
So 5 minutes of silent writing time.
All right. Who wants to go first? Okay, I see one person in the back.
For me, I grew up as a Christian, and so I think this question of the religious versus secular mindset was really profound in a way. Not in a way, it was profound. Growing up Christian, there was too much freedom. You could do whatever you wanted as long as you attended, your Sunday. And in that, I think we naturally as humans with too much, we want to do everything, and we'll do everything. I think that reverting to Islam like brought me structure. So in that religious versus secular, I was wanting that structure so that I know there's things that I can't do. I mean, being a visible Muslim, I'm not really. There's places you really shouldn't be, you know? Like if you're probably in a club, they're gonna be like, what is this girl doing? Like, there's alcohol, I thought she couldn't drink, you know? Or, yeah, that's my perspective on it. I think in that way, we should be appreciative that there is things that we can't do. We should want to represent Islam in the best possible way. But that's just my perspective as a revert. Yeah. Inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. All right, now one of the brothers.
My 2 cents on the topic is basically I noticed that like when it comes to balancing religion versus secular, I noticed that like I and a lot of us tend to get kind of like lost in the sauce, so to speak. Like we're always focused on like, for those of us who have jobs, we're like use our paychecks, like buy the latest car, buy cool clothes, stuff like that. And I've learned not too long ago, to like just like have a balance in like religion versus secular by creating systems and reminders. Like basically, like I will. One thing I like to do is I like to like listen to nasheeds and listen to like different Islamic scholars online, and then it'll kind of just like. So every time I get like too distracted by the dunya, I'll do those things use them as reminders to like just focus more on going to Jannah, the Deen, things like that, and then it creates like more balance, and like I kind of just like had a stronger Deen, basically. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment on the sister's point first, that sometimes وَبِالْأَضْدَادِ تُعْرَفُ الْأَشْيَاءُ. There's a famous Arabic proverb that says sometimes you begin to appreciate a thing by looking at its opposite. So somebody who grew up in a very Christian upbringing where there is this separation between the spirit and the flesh, that physically you can do anything because Jesus died for your sins, as long as you show up at church on Sundays, the rest is free to go. We don't realize how negatively that can impact discipline and structure in your life. Whereas from an Islamic perspective, we have a somewhat more holistic approach to our faith. الْيَوْمَ أَكْمَلْتُ لَكُمْ دِينَكُمْ وَأَتْمَمْتُ عَلَيْكُمْ نِعْمَتِي. That Islam can kind of guide us even the way we sleep, that I'll sleep on the right side. It will guide us on the way we enter the bathroom, our cleanliness, our hygiene. That, for many of us who live in a very godless and unstructured world, it provides us with so much clarity. Like I remember once I was coming back from South Africa and I was sitting next to this elderly South African lady, and she just saw the way I was dressed, so she assumed I was a Muslim, and she started talking to me about politics, Islam, justice. And I quoted this one statement of the Prophet ﷺ regarding justice, how that if you find somebody being oppressed or oppressing, you stop both of them. It's a decently sized hadith. After I mentioned it, she started tearing up, and she said that, that's the most touching thing I've heard regarding religion. And I said that, one of the reasons for this is our Prophet ﷺ, not only does he teach us how to pray, he also laughed with his companions. He hung out with them. He had fun. He had a good time with them. He showed them career choices. He showed them what it means to be a father, a mother, a child. And as Muslims, we learn not to compartmentalize when we have that in mind.
So one way that I've actually seen this manifest around people around me is instead of religious versus secular, people instead replace it with beneficial versus non-beneficial. Like, there's beneficial knowledge, and there's ilm la yanfa, non-beneficial knowledge, right? But in your book itself is an example of how we Muslims can find dini benefits in all dunyawi topics. Like your citations mention, of course, the various scientists, various biologists and archaeologists, but you also mentioned atheist philosophers, and you meant Daniel Dennett and stuff. And then you also mention various Muslim scholars and non-Muslims. And one of the citations is also your 3-year-old daughter. You credit her with one of the...
She's in the category of scholars.
Okay. Scholars include...
My 3-year-old scholarly daughter.
Yeah. So in this, like, how do you address this whole concept of ilm la yanfa, of non-beneficial knowledge?
There is this discussion. What's the timer? Okay, just let me know. It's becoming a nice game. I'm like trying to make sure I beat the clock. So this question Islamically, there's a dua. Allahumma inni as'aluka ilman nafi'a wa a'udhu bika min ilmin la yanfa'. That, Ya Allah, I ask you for beneficial knowledge and I seek your protection from knowledge that is not beneficial. And the scholars explain that beneficial knowledge can be that which is beneficial for your akhirah or it's good for your dunya as well. Unbeneficial, harmful knowledge is that knowledge that is harmful for your world as well as your akhirah. Like, so for instance, this is a random point, but I was speaking to my cousin the other day, just like 3-4 days ago. I was in New York and my relatives were over there. I was speaking to my cousin and he's like, I want to move to Dallas. And I said, oh, mashallah, I noticed that there's this huge hijrah happening for Muslim communities. And I said, okay, where are you going to move to? Near Epic or near ICI or near Valley Ranch? And he's like, listen, I never heard of those terms before. I said, all right, then why are you moving to Dallas? He says, and I'm trying to quote him more particularly, he said that the Fortnite servers are now in Dallas. Any Fortnite guys over here? Anybody? Okay, good, mashallah. It looks like we have a lot of ilm nafi over here. Anyways, so he told me that because the servers have moved to Dallas, I said, listen, I don't understand anything you're saying, but if you're gonna do hijrah to Dallas, my suggestion is just tweak your intentions a little bit, right? Like, supposedly you'll make a lot of money doing this. In my textbook, that is the definition of harmful knowledge, right? Where you know everything about Fortnite and like, there's nothing beneficial over there. I'm not saying it's haram. That's up to you and your creator and your personal life. If you want to waste your time watching a bunch of costume people running around beating each other up, you can tell what I think about it, but that's between you and your creator. But that's what we call unbeneficial knowledge. Knowledge that's not too beneficial. However, Islamically, as we quoted Iqbal earlier on, anything, Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam says, Al-hikmatu dallatul mu'min. Wisdom is the lost knowledge of the believer. Wherever you find it, you take it. If you're able to make something more purposeful, meaningful for your religious growth, then something as basic as pottery, something as basic as painting can be your expression of your faith. Subhanallah, I know people who are into spoken word. Like, that was their strength. Like the shu'ara, Hassan ibn Thabit, he was a sha'ir. But then when he accepted Islam, he used his poetry to praise the Prophet ﷺ, to defend Islam, right? So that's an example of someone taking something that's very profane and mundane, such as poetry, and then using it for Islam. I have friends who are into spoken word. Like, you'll see a lot of these rappers who accept Islam, a lot of them, then they take their talents, or musicians, they take their talents and they use it towards an Islamic cause. Like Yusuf Islam is an example, right? Where he was a famous musician and then he's using that towards an Islamic cause. So to answer the question, am I good on time? That's saying, wait a second. That was 1 minute and 30 seconds. I saw you bring that down to 8 seconds, all right? Listen, you cannot change the clock. I was pacing myself. There was 1 minute and 30. I look this way, I look back, there's 8 seconds left. Listen, I'll give the mic freely, man. Here, take the mic back. I'm joking. It's fine. Hopefully I answered whatever question was posed.
Oh, no, you did, mashallah. So regarding that, the way like I personally see it is like, Islam has an individual aspect and a collective aspect. There's the individual Islam as truth, and then there's the collective Islam as civilization. Like, this individual Islam as truth is your own personal journey to getting close to Allah and achieving the best akhirah. I can take a teacher. Yes, I can read your book. Yes, I can take a guide. But in the end, it's my individual choice to accept it. But then there's the collective Islam. There's the Islam as civilization, where it's the anthropological, sociological, psychological phenomena of preserving and propagating the deen in order to maximize reverence for Allah and His Prophet. It involves art, ethics, aesthetics, science, philosophy, da'wah, community building, culture production, etc. Anything that involves more than one person. And you were mentioning pottery, you were mentioning painting, you were mentioning the musicians, you were mentioning all of these, right? How can we ensure that our passions, from art to cooking, from engineering to gardening, from fashion to the natural sciences, whatever our passions may be, like, for example, Rahim is recording, that his passion is videography. And is him not like spreading these an expression of Islam? Or Or you were talking about the flyer. Naba designed those flyers, right? And inviting people to come.
You shouldn't have said that name. Okay, I apologize 100 times in advance. All right.
Like, isn't this artwork not an expression of Islam? So how can we ensure that whatever our passions may be, how can we ensure that they're expressions of Islam?
Everyone understand the question? All right. How do we ensure that everything that we do, from painting to pottery to trolling people on YouTube and TikTok, or like whatever it is that you get a kick out of, Fortnite or whatnot, how do we make our so-called mundane habits something more religious and Islamic? First of all, I want to be very clear over here, and I don't want anyone to misunderstand me when I say this. Islamically, there are things that are primarily dini, primarily faith-based. Reading Quran will always be purely in the category of the religious. I'm using this in very basic terms. Reading the Quran will always be something that connects you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in ways that doing pottery will never connect you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Reading the hadith, praying salah, crying to Allah, this category of the dini is something that is inseparable to our understanding and commitment to Islam. That said, because of a hadith like إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, actions are based on intention, we have this potential of taking the most mundane things and infusing within it a more Islamic concept. Like, for instance, I gave you the example, videography, for instance. Instead of going around and, taking pictures of pigeons flying in there, which must be really cool, or the architecture, the non-existing architecture of Dallas, or like whatever it is, you're going around and doing that. Like, that's not haram, but it's not like that's your ticket to Jannah either. But using your time for something that's more Islamic, something that can draw people. Like, for instance, I have friends who travel a lot, but they made this point that whether I'm going to Greece, whether I'm going to Turkey, whether I'm going to Saudi, I'm going to take pictures and then I'm going to post about it and try to find relevant ahadith. Try to talk about the creation of Allah. By bringing that twist into something that is otherwise mundane, now gives it a secondary element of being Islamic. Does that make sense? So I want to be clear here that if my job and my profession is videography, me going around and taking pictures of masajid doesn't equate, again, I'm not trying to put you in front of the camera, but like, just taking pictures and doing all of that doesn't equate to reading the Quran. But unlike the secular binary of religious versus secular, it doesn't mean it's bereft of reward as well. And the key is two things. How do I make my mundane practices something more Islamic? Intention. Intention is the most important thing. When I'm going to work in the morning, I can either go to work or I can say I'm going to support my family. Something as simple as that would make me crunching numbers in the most boring job alive or around, or counting pills as a pharmacist, or meeting patients as a doctor, when my intention is I'm going to support my family as a caretaker, and that was the responsibility Allah has given me, goes from being something mundane to something rewarding. When I'm composing poetry, when I am editing videos, when I'm doing things like that, and I try to do something with the intention of drawing people closer to Islam, what is primarily mundane now can take on a flavor of Islam as well.
Jazakallah khairan. And that brings us to prompt 3. Every one of you has a passion, right? And as Mufti Saab said, there are those rituals and beliefs that are purely Islamic, but Islam is more than those rituals and beliefs. Like all these passions, all like the videography that Raheem does and all these things, like everything that you can make Islamic, these are all like expressions of Islam, right? And write on your note card. So you have the notepads and all that, right? But we also gave you index cards in the beginning. So prompt 3 is for your index cards. Islam encompasses more than just rituals and beliefs. What is a passion of yours that can be your own expression of Islam?
Okay, we can have 2 quick sharing. So who wants to go? About how they can turn their passion into a form of expression.
Assalamu alaikum. So to answer this prompt, I connected it to one of the classes I have to take for my major. And it's about the articulations of, what words you pronounce and where it comes from, the certain letters. And lately I've been connecting that back to the Quran and Makharij al-Huruf, where the words of, the words in Arabic come out from. And instead of looking at it as something I'm just studying, I like to connect it back to the Quran, like I said, in order for it to be something meaningful. And that goes back to that, the thing you said earlier about the middle tier in Islam, about taking something of the dunya aspect and connecting that back to the Islamic, meaning of it.
Alhamdulillah. All right, and we'll do one brother. Okay, or we had one other, or we can do another sister.
I had to. I'm Anzar's mom. Assalamu alaikum. So no, I was my passion. When I do that, I'm really passionate about it. So I volunteer at work with hijab on, and in my mind, I'm thinking, because in TSA I have tough time, right? So now when I'm volunteering, I always keep in mind all these people, who think we carry bombs. Now they think that I'm compassionate. Not that I'm representing a community who's compassionate, who care about, all these people around us, all these white people and all that. Yeah.
Both on the tajweed point, because I'm, mashallah, like a tajweed Nazi, so I love tajweed. We can talk about that at a separate time. But to the sister/auntie's point, I think, honestly, sometimes to infuse a level of Islam in your work could be as simple as wearing a hijab, as simple as making sure your conversations in your workplace are a little bit more consciously Muslim. Like, for instance, I'll give you an example. Like, sometimes I have a group of non-Muslim friends, we'll play basketball, for instance, or we'll go do something. I'm very conscious about making sure that I pray salah in between the game. Like, that is something I'm very particular about, even though there's like 2 hours left for Dhuhr salah. I could easily go, not interrupt the game, go home and pray salah. But I make it a point to tell them, listen, I'm gonna need a 5-minute break to go and pray, to show to them how important Islam is in my life, that I'm willing to stop something that I enjoy so that I can go and pray. And doing this for a few months, I've seen the impact of something as subtle as praying in the middle of a game had on them, that then they started asking me like, hey, tell me more about Islam. And mashallah, one of them just accepted Islam recently. So again, we don't even realize the way we can impact people. In your case, just speaking to people in your job, but for us, just stopping for salah or mentioning Allah's name or talking about why we make certain decisions because we follow the Prophet ﷺ as a role model. Mustafa?
Jazakallah khair, Mufti Sahib. I think that's a very beautiful way to end off this very insightful discussion. So if I could first have a round of applause for Mufti Muntasir. Alhamdulillah.